Setting the stage for success, helping students write and support a thesis or focus. Dr. Judi Landrum. We're in Minnesota, and Minnesota, we like our s'mores. And when you do a s'more, you have your graham cracker cookie on the outside, and then you put some chocolate, and then you roast the marshmallows. And there's lots of ways we can roast those marshmallows. We can take the little pointy doodads that you buy at Target or Williams-Sonoma or Costco or wherever else, and then you put your marshmallow on the end and you roast it over the fire. Or you can take a coat hanger and you tear it apart. You just need a pointed end to roast it over the fire. Or you can just take a stick and make a pointed end and roast it over the fire. Either way, as long as you have a pointed end and you've got a point, it's pretty easy to roast those marshmallows. But if you have something like a spoon with a long handle, you can still roast the marshmallows, but it doesn't work very well because it kind of gets all gooey and you lose a whole lot of the marshmallow when you try to flop it on to the graham cracker and the chocolate to make your cookie. Oddly enough, writing a thesis is a little bit that way, because when we write a thesis, we need a clear, specific point in order to bake our text and get it across to our reader. All well-written texts do not have a formally written thesis, but all well-written texts do have a specific point, even a piece of fiction. And as our students develop their thoughts in a written text, their thesis or focus can become lost or messy or unclear if it doesn't have a clear specific point. As a result, this video focuses on some pre-drafting and some feedback strategies that help students support their thesis and or make a point in a given text. The audience for this video really is you as college teachers. However, it may be useful just to show this video to your students, particularly if you have them in an online class. The specific objectives for this workshop are: 1, participants will be able to explain pre-writing strategies in their classes which help their students better focus their writing. 2, participants will be able to apply some post-drafting advice for their students which help their students write and support a more specific thesis or focus. So stage 1, what do you do before writing? Step number 1, require your students to define the rhetorical context for their writing. Who are they writing to? Who is their audience? They're writing some kind of paper on running. It makes a difference if their audience consists of marathon runners, or people who run twice a week, or people who are just trying to get in shape and start running. The audience dictates partially how that text is put together. And along with audience, you also want to know what's your purpose for writing, as well as what's your type of discourse. Are you writing an informative text, a persuasive text, or some type of narrative expressive text for your audience? The second thing that you want your students to do is to write 2 to 4 guiding questions to guide their essay. So when they're writing their guiding question, the purpose behind that is that's what we do as researchers. We don't just go write a paper for a peer-reviewed journal. What we do is we say, this is what I want to find out. Here are the questions guiding my research, and then we do a different type of research depending on the question that we want answered. So it's good that we're starting that same process with our students. So that's the first reason. The second reason we want to do that is it's authentic discovery. If we come into a research paper or any paper we're writing with the idea of this is the answer before we've even done the research, it's kind of like going to the Bible and saying, okay, this is what God thinks about divorce. Now I'm going to go to the scriptures and find some specific examples which support what I already believe. No. You go to the Word of God and say, God, what is your word? Tell me about divorce. And then you read it, contextualize it, and try to figure out what it means, and then draw your conclusions from that. And that's what we want our students doing, is not taking their opinions, but trying to seek what the data says in order to form their ideas. The third reason we want to do that is when students have a guiding question, it helps them define the type of discourse they're writing, because a certain guiding question is going to lead them toward a narrative piece of writing, an informative piece of writing, or a persuasive piece of writing. They may be wanting to write a persuasive text, but their guiding question doesn't lead them in that direction, and then they can figure that out quickly and make the change before they've written the whole text. The last reason, which I have no data to support whatsoever other than anecdotal as a classroom teacher, is that for some reason, when students, whether they are high school, college freshmen, or graduate students, when they write from a guiding question, it helps them keep their writing more organized and more focused than when they write from a statement. So, what would be an example of that? Let's say, for example, your topic is immigration. So if a topic's immigration and a student's guiding question might be, what joys and hardships did my grandpa experience when he immigrated to the United States from Nigeria? That would lead to an expressive or a narrative type text. Second type of guiding question. What is the process immigrants must navigate to become U.S. citizens? That will set up an informative piece of writing. Third, should we allow all people groups to settle in the United States and become U.S. citizens? That's going to set up a persuasive type of writing. Now, we've talked about before writing, now let's get into pre-writing. So the student has figured out, this is my topic, this is where I'm going, these are my guiding questions. So the next stage is your students need to do research, whether that is interviewing, whether that's reading articles, whether it's looking at other types of online resources. The next step is to do research. Then once they've got some research, then they want to take that, and there's a lot of different ways that they can do pre-writing depending on their topic, how long it is, what works best for them, but I'm going to explore some of those options. One of those options is a traditional outline, where you say, here is my main point and here are the subpoints that go under that, using the research that you have. Another way is to do mapping, which is similar to an outline. It's just a little more freewheeling because you will have a center circle with your guiding question, and then you will have spokes out from that center circle, which give examples of various topics that are exploring your guiding question. The advantage of an map over an outline is that it gives you a little more flexibility, but some people get lost in that flexibility and an outline works better for them. A third method that students can use, or all of us can use actually for pre-writing, is brainstorming, where you just list everything that you want to include in your paper, not in any type of order or any type of subpoints, but you just list all that information. A fourth way is to do what's called free writing or rapid writing. That's where you've got all your ideas in here, you're not really sure where they go, or maybe you are sure where they go. Then you take your guiding question and then you write as quickly as you can, trying to answer that question and just get all that information out. Then you will go back and impose some organization on your text after you've done your free writing. The last method that I want to tell you about is called Toulmin's analysis. And I'm going to give an abbreviated version of Toulmin's analysis, and this is exclusively for pre-writing in a persuasive text. So for Toulmin's analysis, the first step is the same of any type of text. You define your guiding question. Then you take that guiding question and you form it into a claim. And the claim might be, let's say the guiding question is back to, should we allow all people groups to settle in the United States and become U.S. citizens? The claim may be, and we're not getting political, this is just a topic here, okay? The claim may be, all people groups should be allowed to settle in the United States and become U.S. citizens. Then after you have your claim, then you say, what are the caveats to my claim? What are the exceptions to the rule? So an example of the exception to the rule might be, people who have been convicted of a crime in their native country may not immigrate to the United States and become U.S. citizens. Then after that, as a writer, you're going to list the pros of your topic on one side and your cons of the topic on the other side. And then see, okay, well, which outweighs the other? And that should help you determine, do I keep this thesis or do I rewrite this thesis or my claim? Then under each pro and con, what are some assumptions that go along with that? And I'm just going to list a few. So let's say an example of a pro, why all immigrants should be allowed to immigrate to the United States and become U.S. citizens. A pro would be, it's based on the American ideal of freedom, okay? What assumptions do I have with that? The first assumption is that they will be more free in the United States than they may be in their native country. A second assumption may be that Americans all have this ideal or philosophy that all people should be free and that we open our doors to everyone. Okay, what would be a con of that philosophy? What would be a con of allowing all citizens to settle, allowing all immigrants to come to the United States and become U.S. citizens? So a con may be the U.S. cannot afford to open its doors to all people groups. What is the assumption underlying that position? The assumption is that if we allow all of our immigrants to become U.S. citizens, it will actually deplete our resources as opposed to possibly increasing our resources. And then, as you might know, after you've got all your pros and cons listed, then when you go to write that paper, you'll take all the cons, everything against your argument, put them just into one paragraph, then take all your pros that are for your argument, and each one of them become its separate paragraph because you want to make a point to your reader. Okay, so we've got our pre-writing finished. The next step for your student or writer is to draft the text. When it comes to drafting strategies, again, you can do the free writing method, or you write from an outline or from a map or from a Toulmin's analysis or any of those. But regardless of your strategy, be sure that you tell your students that once they begin writing from their guiding question, to write as quickly as possible and not stop and make spelling corrections or grammar corrections or that's not the right word or whatever else, because we know that that's how experienced writers write as opposed to novice writers. Novice writers seem to stop every other word or every sentence. Experienced writers get it all down, then they go back and fix it. And the reason for that is when you get it all down, then your text has more coherence and more organization and usually more fluency. So that's why we want to encourage our students or ourselves as writers to write that way. Now, after that text is drafted, then we encourage our students, the next step is push your paper aside and say, okay, now that I've written that, what do I really believe is the truth? And what do I really want to tell my reader? And then that becomes your thesis or the focus of your text if you're writing something a little more informal. After you've decided this is what I believe to be true, such as all immigrants to the United States should be allowed in and should be allowed to become U.S. citizens, why do I believe that? Then those become your supporting points. Now, you may say, well, you kind of already told me to do that with the outline, which is true. But the next level you do that is after the text is drafted, because often that's where the problem occurs. We know the thesis, we've got all the information, but it's sort of a disorganized nightmare sometimes, or it's just disorganized. So what you can do is, you've got everything written, and it may be disorganized, so you're figuring out how can I make a clear point and how can I add organization into my text. So again, you determine your thesis, and then you write it down. Make sure you've got it clear. Next step, you read each hunk of the text and write beside it the idea that belongs with that hunk of the text. Next thing, you ask, does each hunk support the thesis focus of the text? If it doesn't support it, you're going to have to delete it. Then you also ask yourself, do any of these hunks need to be combined or separated, or do any of the hunks need further development? So if you have underdeveloped paragraphs, then what you do is you decide, do I combine them? Do I just delete them because there's never going to be enough information on that point? Or there are things that I can add to further develop my paragraph or my point, such as quotes, specific examples, reasons, explanations, stories, anecdotes, facts, stats. All of those things can help further develop an underdeveloped idea or often paragraph. Now I want to model that process for you with a freshman level college essay. And this is a paper on ethanol. So this is a draft that I'm showing you, a very rough draft, that how do I impose organizational structure on this draft? So I'm going to read it to you. After I read it, then we'll go back through and say, what are the key ideas? How is this structured and put together? When you see a field of corn, there's more than meets the eye. Up until now, corn was looked upon for basically used as food for animals or people. Now corn is looked at as one of the leading renewable fuels. The way that this is made possible is by ethanol production. There are two ways that ethanol, specifically ethanol from corn, can be produced. The most common is called dry milling, but there is a wet milling process as well. In the dry milling process, as explained at the Renewable Fuels Association website, the dry corn from the farm is run through a series of hammer mills that grind up the corn into a fine flour, also known as meal. This meal is then added with water to form a corn mash. To this mash, in order to make the starch into a simple sugar, enzymes are added. Ammonia is also added as a food for the yeast and to control the pH. Ethanol production is a very refined process, and just a little change in pH can affect the quality and quantity of ethanol. The mash is then produced into high-temperature cookers of about 120 to 150 degrees Celsius. This is done to reduce bacteria levels ahead of fermentation. The mash is then cooked to 95 degrees Celsius and transferred to the large ferment tanks where the yeast is added, and the magic of the conversion to sugar ethanol and also the byproduct of carbon dioxide is produced and cleaned and collected at this stage. The difference between wet and dry milling is that wet milling is soaked in water to dilute sulfurous acid for 1 or 2 days. The soaking helps the separation of the grain into its many component parts. One of the many parts, starch, is then fermented from which point on the process is the same as dry milling. During the fermentation process, which takes about 40 to 50 hours, the mash is agitated and kept cool to help the growth and activity of the yeast. The now beer is transferred to distillation columns where the ethanol is separated from everything else. This ethanol is about 190 proof, but is bumped up to 200 proof by dehydration using a molecular sieve system. Once the ethanol is at this stage, it's blended with a few % of gasoline to make it undrinkable. Once undrinkable, it can be shipped to terminals for further mixture and consumer use. Okay, as you can see, there's a lot of information there, but it's not making a lot of sense because it's disorganized. So we've got to figure out what's the point. What's the point we're trying to make? So now I've revised that to a thesis. So here's a potential thesis for that text. Because ethanol appears to be emerging as the primary source of renewable fuel for the future, we Americans need to be aware of its production process as well as its advantages and disadvantages. Okay? That's the thesis. So now let's go through this text and start putting it into hunks. We look at the first part. When you see a field of corn, there's more than meets the eye. Up until now, corn was looked upon for basically use as food for animals or people. Now corn is looked at as one of the leading renewable fuels. The way that this is made possible is by ethanol production. Okay, that is dealing with the first part of the thesis because ethanol appears to be emerging as the primary source of renewable fuel for the future. So this is going to be my intro, and I'm going to write beside this little hunk renewable fuel, because I know that's the hunk it belongs to. Quite frankly, there's not quite enough information here. So if I keep this as my intro, I'm going to need a little more information to flesh that out more fully, and then I will end it with my thesis statement, which I already read to you. The next paragraph says, there are two ways that ethanol, specifically ethanol from corn, can be produced. The most common is called dry milling, but there's a wet milling process as well. The dry milling process is explained through renewable fuels, dry corn from the farm, blah, 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 blah. So the rest of this paragraph really deals with differentiating between the dry milling process and the wet milling process. So I would write to the side differences between dry milling and wet milling. Next paragraph. The mash is then processed into high-temperature cookers of about 120 to 150 degrees Celsius. This is done to reduce bacteria levels and so on and so forth. The rest of this paragraph deals mostly with the process of ethanol production, and it seems to be sort of like step 2 of the process. So I'm going to put to the side process step 2 question mark. Next paragraph. The difference between dry and wet milling is that wet milling is soaked in water to dilute sulfurous acid for 1 to 2 days. This soaking helps the separation of grain into its many component parts. One of the many parts, starch, and so on and so forth. I'm going back to talking about dry milling versus wet milling. So again, to that side, I'm going to put difference between dry and wet milling. Next paragraph. During the fermentation process, which takes 40 to 50 hours, the mash is agitated and kept cool to help the growth and activity of the yeast. The now beer, so on and so forth. So this talks about the next step, so I put to the side, again, process, maybe step 2. Next paragraph. Once ethanol is at this stage, it's blended with a few percent of alcohol to make it undrinkable. Once undrinkable, it can be shipped to terminals for further mixture and consumer use. Process, again, that's what this deals with, possibly step 3. So now let's see, what does this look like when it's all put together? So let's go back. I'm not going to include the intro paragraph just because of time. We only have so much time right now. But let's start with the thesis. Because ethanol appears to be emerging as the primary source of renewable fuel for the future, we Americans need to be aware of its production process as well as its advantages and disadvantages. Okay, so this is the end of the intro. We will use the same information that I already showed you about when you see a field of corn, but it needs a little bit more information to flesh that out. Then that part will be covered. Next paragraph. There are two ways that corn ethanol can be produced, dry milling and wet milling. Of the two, dry milling is used more frequently. The difference between wet and dry milling is that wet milling is soaked in water for 1 to 2 days before it's processed in order to dilute its sulfurous acid. This soaking helps the separation of the grain into its many component parts, some of which are used to produce ethanol and others which are discarded. Other than soaking the grain, the remainder of the process for producing ethanol is the same for dry milling as it is for wet milling. So you see we've got all that. So we've taken all the information from the text that had to do with the differences between the processes. In the first step of the dry milling process, all the ingredients are mixed together. First, the dry corn is run through a series of hammer mills that grind up the corn into a fine flour, also known as meal. This meal is then added with water to form a corn mash. In order to make the starch into a simple sugar, enzymes are added to the corn mash. As the corn mash begins to ferment, yeast is added to aid the fermenting process, and ammonia is added to control the pH. Ethanol production is very precise. A slight change in pH can affect the quality and quantity of the final ethanol product. So if you'll notice, then we went back to the point we had about process step 2, but added some information so it's a little more clear to the reader. In the second step of the ethanol process, the corn mash cooks and ferments. The corn mash boils between 120 to 150 degrees Celsius in high-temperature cookers. Cooking the corn mash at a high heat prior to fermentation reduces bacteria levels. Once the corn mash cools down to 95 degrees Celsius, it is transferred to the large ferment tanks where the yeast is added. During the fermentation process, the mash is agitated and kept cool to help the growth and activity of the yeast, kept cool to help the growth and activity of the yeast. After fermenting for 40 to 50 hours, the corn mash is converted to sugar ethanol. In addition to the sugar ethanol, the byproduct of the corn mash is carbon dioxide, which is cleaned, collected, and stored immediately. Okay, so then we've got another process step, use the information that was in the text, but explained a little more. Final process step. In the third step for the ethanol, which is similar to beer at this point, is transferred to distillation columns where the pure ethanol is separated from everything else. This ethanol is about 190 proof, but if it's dehydrated through a molecular sieve system, its concentration can be increased to 200 proof. Once the ethanol is at this stage, it is blended with X amount % of gasoline to make it undrinkable. Once undrinkable, it can be shipped to terminals for further mixture and consumer use. So we've got our text drafted. You would also, again, have to add an intro and a concluding paragraph. But let's see if we've hit the thesis. So going back to the thesis of the point, because you're always going back to that thesis, always going back to that point to make sure the two fit each other. So we go back to the thesis, which says, because ethanol appears to be emerging as the primary source of renewable fuel for the future. Have we addressed that? Yes, we addressed that in the intro, although it does need more development. Next part of the thesis. We Americans need to be aware of its production process. Have we addressed that in the text? Yes. The rest of the text that I read all dealt with the production process. We've completely explained the production process, dry milling, wet milling, the differences, and the rest of the process. Third point of the thesis. Production process, as well as its advantages and disadvantages. We did not discuss advantages and disadvantages at all. So as a writer, I have two options. Option number one is, I'm going to take that out of my thesis because I didn't address it at all. So I can take it out, and then the first part I did prove. But if I'm thinking, my audience would really like to know what the advantages and disadvantages are of these two processes, or the advantages and disadvantages of ethanol overall, then I might add that as another section to my text. But I've got two choices. Add something to my text or take this out of my text. So that's the explanation, and let's go back to the beginning. If you notice throughout this conversation, this video, I kept going back to point. I kept going back to look at your thesis, look at your point, because that's the main thing here. So I'm hoping that the point was clear to you and that as participants, by the end of this video, that you are able to, one, you know how to apply pre-writing strategies in your classes which help your students better focus their writing, and two, that you can apply some post-drafting advice for your students, which will help them write and support a more specific thesis or focus. So hopefully, just like making those s'mores using some sort of a pointed object as opposed to a spoon, you can help your students get the point across from their paper, which is their thesis. Thank you.